All right, well, welcome to Bitcoin and the Bible. This is a Knox alumni exclusive event and opportunity. My name is Matt Till with Knox Theological Seminary, the Director of Communications here at Knox. And today we're with Dr. Timothy Fox. And we're going to kind of dive into this whole idea of Bitcoin and the Bible, theology. Why is the seminary even talking about this? It's going to be a good time. And again, this is an exclusive, really exclusive opportunity for our alumni here at Knox. We try to provide these opportunities as much as we can for you to kind of gain continued access to Knox Theological Seminary, and for you to be able to continue to engage and hear from, faculty members that maybe you had, or maybe some of our newer faculty members, and also continue to be at the ground level of kind of some of new thinking, emerging thinking, and deep theology as well. And so we're really excited for you, and just thank you for being and taking time out of your day today to be a part of this. Just as a reminder, just for our audience, we are going to be recording this today, and it will be available to our alumni later on this week, and then also potentially also to broader audiences beyond that. So if you're watching this as a recording, thanks for finding it. We're glad you found it, and you can always learn more about Knox at knoxseminary.edu. For their live participants, the chat box is open, so feel free to chat with us if you've got some dialogue or things you want to, some ideas that you've got. We are hearing from some of you already that maybe you have some experience in this area of Bitcoin, and so we'd love to hear from you. Dialogue with us in the chat during Tim's presentation. But then also too, there's the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom of your window here. If you'll just open that up at Q&A, you can actually just go ahead and type in questions as you have them. If you've got something specifically for Tim and you would like us to address a question that maybe you might have, that would be a great place for that, because we'll monitor that. And then there'll be time at the end of the webinar today to get some of those questions in. So without further ado, Tim, thanks again for joining us and doing this great presentation. First of all, tell us briefly, like, how did you get into Bitcoin? I found out you were speaking at a conference down here in Miami earlier this year, and it was a big Bitcoin conference. So how does a seminary professor show up at a Bitcoin conference to talk about Bitcoin?
Yeah, it started out really as just kind of a personal side interest in economics that I've had for a long time, and eventually kind of landing on questions about what money is, which we'll talk about today, and the kind of history of money and monetary technology, which got me into Bitcoin. A lot of people get into it kind of as a way to try to get rich. That wasn't really it for me, and that's not just because I'm spiritual, but it was more just the economics behind it and just something I've always been interested in. And so I've just been kind of going more and more into it, especially in the last couple of years in the run up to all the COVID stuff. Could see kind of what was happening in China and thought, wow, if this thing spreads around the world, I bet governments are going to do some really crazy stuff with money. And I should learn a lot more about Bitcoin. And so that really got me digging a lot more deeply into it, just thinking about historically the way governments have responded to crises in the past and the way that they abused their power to create money. And so, yeah, just been digging more into it in the last couple of years, and have run across a lot of Christians in the Bitcoin space, and through them have found more opportunities to talk to more Christians about it. And yeah, I've spoken at this conference. I spoke at a conference this year. I've led some prayer breakfasts at other conferences. I'll say something at the end about there's a lot of Christians in the Bitcoin world. And yeah, I'm in Austin. Austin's kind of a bit of a hub for Bitcoin and tech. And it's been really neat spending time with these people and seeing this intersection between my day job as a pastor and a professor, and then this side interest and hobby. They're kind of starting to blend together somewhat.
Well, it reminds me that, it seems like theology touches all areas and all aspects of life. And so this is just kind of being another one, as you're kind of noting some of the socioeconomic and things that are changing in our world right now. And this is an emerging new opportunity, maybe a technology. There's things involved that are called Bitcoin, and then this blockchain. You're going to explain all that, I hope, for us today. But yeah, then also, of course,
the Belgic Confession, which is a confession from Switzerland from the Reformation period. It talks about God revealing himself through two books. One of them is general revelation, one of them is special revelation. And, as a Christian, we're called to be always reading these books. And they're both, in both of them, God is speaking to us. He speaks to us most clearly in the book of the Bible. And we take the Bible with us and we use it to help us understand the book of the world or of nature, of creation better. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to look around and read the book of this world and its economics and its governments and its money, even though the Bible doesn't explicitly say anything about digital currency. It has, even the Bible has a lot to say specifically about money and about economic issues and about what God wants and what's right and what's wrong. And it's trying to apply this. I mean, at the end of the day, theology is just applying God's word to life in his world. And so I'm trying to do that. And you guys might not agree with everything I have to say. That's fine. I told my church, I gave this presentation to my church, and I told them at the beginning, I said, what I'm saying in this talk is very different than the kinds of things that I will say from behind the pulpit in terms of its authority and how you should respond to it. There's a lot more gray area around these issues, and Christians, I think, have a lot more room to disagree, even though I will try to make a case for me being right and lots of people being wrong.
Well, I think that's a great way to get us started here and to remind us as to where does this sit, especially as we do this as a presentation from the present, the position of a seminary, right? And one of our cherished faculty members as well too, that this is an area of perhaps some grayness, but in where places we can disagree, right? Major on the majors, minor on the minors. But this seems like a great opportunity for us to discuss and get into it. So just as a reminder for those of you who are here live with us today, please take advantage of the chat feature. I'd love to hear from you during Tim's presentation. And then, of course, if you have any specific or direct questions for him, please leave them in the Q&A, and then I'll come back in at the end of his presentation, and we'll have an opportunity to get those questions heard. So, Tim, you've got some slides for us, and why don't you go ahead and get us started?
All right, let me get this going. All right, you guys good? You see the slides? If you want to pull up these slides either now or later, I have them posted as a couple different formats at our church's website. You can see that URL there at the bottom. I'm going to start out by talking about what money is, briefly on on the history of it, the purpose that it serves, and then I'm going to talk about some of the problems that we've seen in our world and in our history with money when money goes bad, and why and how Bitcoin, to me, seems to be a pretty good solution to a lot of the problems as a new form of technology that brings some issues with it and some possible problems. And all technology in a fallen world can bring great blessings, but also great curses with it. But I think overall, I think Bitcoin is a good thing, and I think it's a good thing for our world, especially for people in the world that are struggling and have been treated very poorly for a long time. And then I'm going to talk about the Bible and the Westminster Confession, especially, and what it has to say about money and how Bitcoin may fit into that, and some of the issues I'm going to talk about with money and money going sideways. I'm a Presbyterian, and so I subscribe to the Westminster Standards as a good summary of what the Bible teaches. Not perfect, not on the same level as the Bible, but I think it summarizes well. And one of the things that it does quite famously is it takes the 10 Commandments and it delineates them in very great detail in terms of here's a lot of different ways that the 10 Commandments apply. And so I'll show you by walking through some of those pieces of the larger catechism, how some of these things apply to issues around money and economics and property. And then I'll end by just talking about some applications in terms of how can Bitcoin help us to wrap our heads around the world we're living in right now, ministry in the world we're living in right now, missions around the world, and also to just share a little bit of my own experience here in Austin, getting to know lots of Bitcoin people and some really just amazing evangelistic and spiritual opportunities I've had through all that. But anyways, we'll start out with what money is. Money is one of these things that we use all the time. It touches on almost every aspect of our lives. It has been around for thousands and thousands of years, and because of that, it's easy to take it for granted and to not have to think that much about it. But when you start asking what money is and what makes good money good and bad money bad, it opens up all kinds of very serious questions and very meaningful questions about what we're doing here, how we relate to each other, various shades of sin and oppression and where they come from. The Bible talks about money all the time. Old Testament, New Testament, it's everywhere. Jesus is always teaching about money. I think the Bible has so much to say about money because it is so connected to our lives, what we're doing all over the place. Just about every interaction you have with other people at some level is going to be touched by money pretty quickly. But because it's so important in our lives, and because money has so much to do with the future, and it has so much to do with us learning how to deal with uncertainty about the future, for those reasons, money is also very dangerous. It very easily becomes an idol. It becomes something that substitutes for God. And so I think this is why the Bible warns about money a lot. And Jesus, of course, he's always warning about the danger of being wealthy. Sometimes Christians take those warnings, they see that the Bible is saying, be careful. And they say, well, there's something wrong or there's something unspiritual about money itself, or Christians shouldn't really be talking about these things. They shouldn't be dealing with these things. And I don't think that's a good conclusion to draw from it. The correct conclusion to draw is money is really important. It's a gift from God. It's a piece of technology that people have invented. We should use it well. We should use it for his sake and be careful and sober about the temptations that come with it. I had this verse earlier from Jesus's parable in Luke 16 about the unfaithful manager. And Jesus says, hey, you should be a lot more like this crooked accountant who cooked the books of his boss so that he could have good friends when he got fired. Jesus, of course, is not encouraging us to lie or to cheat in our work, but he does say, the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than you guys. And so he says, you should be more like them in this way. You should make friends with unrighteous wealth so that when it fails, which it will, Bitcoin will fail in the grand scheme of eternity. When it fails, you can receive them into eternal heavenly dwellings. And then Jesus closes that parable by saying, if you've not been faithful with the unrighteous wealth, who's going to entrust you the true riches? Sometimes we can be more spiritual than Jesus and think we don't need to think about money. We don't need to deal with it. We don't need to worry about economics. We don't need to worry about this world or what's happening in it. We just need to sit around and wait and go to heaven. And I think that's not at all what the New Testament teaches, and it's not what Jesus teaches. Money is a tool that people invented, and it's been invented all over the world. It wasn't like one person came up with it. But it's a way of comparing different things, comparing what you have and what you want, especially when there's a third thing that two people don't currently have or want. So like if I have eggs and you have bread, what if I want another guy, a third guy, what if I want his wood? How do we figure out how to trade with each other so that I can figure out how much his wood is worth in terms of my eggs or your bread? Money is a way of comparing things, of being able to track the value of things, not only across space, like, well, I want to send something somewhere else, but also across time. I also want to be able to measure how valuable this thing is as time goes on. Typically, people tend to land on certain kinds of money. There's some things that work really well as money and other ones that don't. Or sometimes things work well as money for a period of time, and then something else comes in that works better as money, and people will naturally gravitate towards that new thing unless somebody is forcing them to use an inferior form of money. Typically, money is what we call the most saleable commodity around. When we say something saleable, that means it's easy to transfer. It's easy to trade with other people. Your house is usually not very saleable because it takes a long time to sell your house. You have to hire people to help you do it. You have to fix lots of things. It has a lot of value, but it's not saleable. It's not something that I can just decide, okay, I'm just going to transfer this tomorrow. I'm going to transfer part of it tomorrow. And so typically money is a thing laying around that is most saleable. And there's a lot of things that go into something becoming saleable or transferable. Some of these things, here's some questions that help us think about what makes something saleable, what makes it something that I can liquidate and transfer to other people. The first one is, does it last? Is it something that's going to corrode or degrade over time? Another one, the second one, portable. Is it something I can move? Or is it too big or too heavy? Third one, is it fungible? That means, is one of these comparable to another one of them? Can I swap them easily with each other? Something like a diamond is not very fungible because diamonds are in all different sizes and qualities. And so typically people have not used diamonds for money unless in extreme circumstances. The fourth one on there, is it verifiable? Can I test it? Can I figure out if this thing is really what so-and-so is claiming that it is? Is it easy for me to tell if this is the real deal or if I'm being cheated or counterfeited? The next one on there, is it divisible? Can I split it into smaller pieces? It's another reason diamonds don't typically work as money, is you can't really split them. You have kind of one piece and you can't break it apart into fourths or tenths or hundredths or whatever. The next one on there, and this is perhaps the most important one, is how scarce is it? Is it hard to make more of it? Or is it something that I could easily kind of just manufacture and then suddenly I have a bunch of money that other people don't have? We'll talk more about this in a second. The last one on, or the second to last one on there, is it something that other people have valued for a long time? How long have people cared about this? I might have something that is incredibly valuable that I think is great money and valuable, but if I can't convince anybody else that it's valuable, then I'm never going to be able to use it as money. And the last one on there is how resistant to censorship is it? Can somebody steal it from me? Can they block me from sending it to someone else? Can they keep me from doing anything with it? These are all things that make good money good, and on the flip side would make bad money bad. This little chart shows you kind of a history of a very crude history of money over the last however many thousands of years. People have used lots and lots of different things as money. They've used shells, they've used arrowheads, they've used salt, they've used tobacco. Eventually, people started using precious metal. I mean, by the time the Bible is written, this is pretty much what people are doing now. They're using metals, and that the reason they land on metals instead of something like shells is because of those properties I just showed you. Metals like gold or silver work much better as money versus something like a shell or something like an arrowhead, because they're hard to make. It's hard to make more of it. It's easy to tell if it's the real deal. I can split it up. I can melt it down. For a long time, people use these couple of metals, and they use some metals instead of other ones. Mainly because certain metals are very hard to come by. Gold is very scarce. It's hard to find more of it. It's hard to make more of it. Something like iron, there's a lot of it laying around. It's not that valuable. What happened after we started using metals as money, precious metals as money, is eventually, because it's hard to move around, people started putting them in banks. And when they put them in banks, eventually what the banks started doing is they would give you little receipts. They'd say, okay, here's a piece of paper that says that you own this much gold in my bank. And as long as you trusted that bank, that they weren't doing funny things with your gold and that you could believe them when they said that they really had it there, then what eventually happened is those pieces of paper that were a promise that I own this amount of gold at such and such bank, those pieces of paper began also functioning as money. People started accepting those as money because, at this point, the money is no longer itself the metal. The money is also promises about the metal. We would say it was backed by the metal, usually gold. But what banks started doing is, and they did this, of course, very quickly, is they said, well, if not everybody comes around demanding their gold, then we can actually put out more of these receipts than we actually have gold to back it up. So this is called fractional reserve banking, where you issue more money than you actually have the assets to back it. And so the amount of money floating around in the community is increasing, even though there's not an equal increase in the amount of commodity behind it. And so this keeps going and going and going, and this causes lots of problems, off and on. But eventually what happens, and this started happening about 100 years ago. It really accelerated in the early 70s. The link between paper money and metals backing it, behind it, that link got severed. So that now everywhere in the world, money is it's what we call fiat money. That's a Latin word. You have this word in the first verse of the Bible, in the Vulgate, where it says that God said, let there be light. Fiat means, let it be. The government speaks money into existence, and there's nothing behind it except that you have to just trust that the government is saying it's money and you're being forced to use it, and we won't accept your taxes and anything else. And if you don't do what we say and you don't pay your taxes and this piece of paper that we now tell you is money, if you don't pay your taxes, we are going to throw you in prison over it. And so it's backed by force. It's backed by trusting in a government. It's no longer backed by something physical in the world with inherent scarcity or value. And so Bitcoin is an attempt to move away from this system where money is controlled by a small number of very powerful people who can decide how much of it they get to make. What is Bitcoin? To put it in one sentence, Bitcoin is a global monetary digital network of computers that are issuing a fixed supply on a predictable schedule of 21 million units. So it's a global network of computers issuing a fixed supply of units. There's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin, and it's being issued according to a schedule that everybody knows ahead of time. Nobody's in charge of it. There's no CEO of Bitcoin. There's no company that runs it or that makes sure that it's going to issue these units of Bitcoin at a certain pace. It's the rules of it are spread out all over the world. The money that's at the heart of the network is what incentivizes everybody in the network to play by the rules. If you don't want to play by the rules, you don't get the money. You don't get rewarded. And so there's three basic components to Bitcoin. There are what we call keys. These are, you can kind of think of them as like passwords. The way that you update the record of Bitcoin, we call this a ledger or a blockchain. The way that that record gets updated is by taking your key and showing it to the rest of the network. And it shows that you have permission to update the Bitcoin that is located at certain addresses on the network. Only there's a private side of this key and there's a public side of this key. Only you know the private side unless you tell it to somebody or they hold a gun to your head and say, tell me what it is. But when you go and you say, I want to send some money around on the network, you then are communicating a public, what's called a public signature to everybody, to where everybody can see from their end that you have the permission to move it, but they could never guess what your key is. It's a one-way. It's easy to verify that you have permission to do what you're doing, but it's incredibly difficult to pretend to be you, if that makes sense. So that's the keys. That shows, I own this much Bitcoin over here. You also have what are called nodes. These are small computers, simple computers that are all keeping a record of all the transactions. They keep a record of what we call the blockchain. These are, relatively easy to start and to run. They are all just recognizing, making sure that everyone's playing by the rules, that you actually really do have permission to move these certain Bitcoin that you're claiming that you do. They are updating each other every 10 minutes. They all, issue what's called the next block, the next chunk of transactions on the network. So you take your key and you broadcast to these nodes, these computers. You say, I'd like to send some Bitcoin. So you tell them that. They check to make sure that you're who you claim to be. And then they send it to what are called the miners, which is another kind of computer, who then are racing with each other to try to discover the next piece of the record. And when those miners discover that piece, and then they bundle your transaction and they add it on to the end of the blockchain. And so the record then gets updated with those 10 minutes. And the nodes are making sure that the miners are not cheating and not trying to ruin everything for everybody. So you have the keys, you have the nodes, and then you have these miners, which are a different kind of computer. What they're doing basically is racing each other to guess a number out of a very large number of possible options. They are the ones who are deciding which transactions to take next based on how much you're willing to pay to get bumped up on the list. And it kind of like with your keys, it's easy to verify when the miners are doing what they should be doing, but it's very difficult to just decide, I'm going to guess this number. You need to apply a lot of work, a lot of electricity to guessing the next number. This is Bitcoin's connection to the real world. It's basically electricity or energy applied through mathematics and physics in order to find a secure to keep a record of transactions secure. Here is the schedule of Bitcoin being issued. The blue line is showing you how many Bitcoin exist. Earlier this year, we hit 90% of Bitcoin are now out there. There's only 10% of all the Bitcoin that ever will be, only 10% of it's left. It's going to take over 100 years for us to do that. Every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that get issued with each block, that's the reward for these miners for putting all this work in. Every 4 years, that number of Bitcoin gets cut in half. And so you know that's coming. So you can see there, almost all, most of the Bitcoin has now been issued. And we only have 10% to go. That green line is where we're at right now. So that's what money is. That's what Bitcoin is. Why should we care about this? Well, why is Bitcoin important? What problems are going on in the world? I've alluded to some of it already. One of them, I think the main one, is this problem of inflation, or another way you could describe this is debasement. Like we said, typically, and this has happened all over the world for ever since money has existed. If somebody is powerful and they can get in charge of money, or they are very crafty and they can figure out how to counterfeit more of it, they can make more money for themselves and their friends, and that allows them to go out and buy stuff. And the closer you are to the people who can counterfeit more money or produce more money, the closer you are connected to them, the better off you are, because you get to go buy things first before everybody else catches on with what's happening. So if you are issuing money and you are closely connected to investors and bankers, and you're issuing this new money to them so that they will help you and they'll vote for you and do those kinds of things, you all, with those bankers and those investors and everybody, you're all really happy because you get to use this new money first. But by the time the money trickles down to, let's say, the guy on the street selling tacos, now everybody's starting to realize there's a lot more money floating around. And we only have a couple of ways to deal with that. You either have to raise your prices, or you have to make your tacos smaller. The quality of them has to go down. But no matter what, the problem is that when new money is created, it never gets created evenly at the same time for everybody all at once. It always starts somewhere. People, the most powerful people, the people that have the most power over money, or the greatest ability to fake it and create more of it. And then it goes to their friends, or it goes to the kinds of things they want to spend their own money on. And then it eventually reaches everybody else. This is what we call inflation. There's been different ways that people have done it over the years. That first one on there, coin clipping. The reason that some of our coins have little ridges on the edges of them is because they used to be made of valuable metal. They're now made of metal that's not valuable at all. But they used to be made of silver. And so what you could do was you could shave off the edges of those coins without anyone being able to really tell. The shapes still kind of look the same. And if you shaved it enough, then you could get enough silver shavings to be able to melt it down and create new coins and to counterfeit it. And so they put those ridges on there so that you could tell if somebody had been shaving it. Another way that you can do this is through what's called debasement, where you take a bunch of coins and you melt them down and you add in a metal that is not very valuable. And then you now have a bunch more coins and you send them back out. So the Romans did this. A lot of people have done this. The Romans, would do this. They would collect their taxes, silver usually. They would melt it down. They would add some other metal, and they would send it back out into the empire. But they would first, pay off the things they wanted to pay for, pay their friends, buy certain things, and then there's a lot more money now floating around in the world. The way we do it today is through just the government saying, "Here's more money. We're going to decide." It's just as easy for the United States government to create money as it is for Venezuela to create money. You push a button on a computer, and there's more money. They're not literally printing money. The physical money is actually a small percentage of the money that actually exists in the world. Most money is on digital records on banks and central banks, but all they have to do is press a button on a computer, and there's more money. Here's a chart of the denarius in the Roman Empire. You guys, know from your study of the Bible, the story about Jesus being given a coin, denarius, and says, whose picture is on this? And it's Tiberius Caesar. And there's a debate about what does it mean his picture is on that coin. Here's what the Romans were doing with this coin. You can see about 100 BC, I know it's kind of a fuzzy chart, but 100 BC, that coin was almost entirely made of silver. By the time you get to Jesus's lifetime in the 1st century, it's down to about 80% silver percentage. You get to the 3rd century, it's down to about 40% percentage being silver, and then things just really go crazy from there. And they basically got rid of all the silver. They debased the money. They were creating more and more and more of it as a way to deal with their spending and their problem of spending more money than they could afford to. The US dollar has done the same thing for the last, especially 100 years. This is 2 charts getting at the same point from 2 different directions. On the left, you have the value of $1 in 1913, which is when the Federal Reserve, the current central bank, when that started, and then how much that $1 is worth since then. So you can see today, what $1 would have bought you in 1913 will now buy you about 5 cents of stuff. Looking at that chart on the right, this is the same thing, but flipped around. This is how much money you would need in order to buy something that you would have had to pay $100 for in 1792. 1792 is when the US dollar began. What you can see on this chart is that the value of $100 more or less stayed the same until the early 20th century. You can see there's a couple of bumps there. Those bumps are wars. Through the history of humanity, the greatest opportunity that powerful people have used to print more money is around war. War is very expensive. You need a lot of money to do it, and it's similar in the US history. So this happened in the wake of the War of 1812, happened during the Civil War. That's what those 2 little bumps are. But more or less, the money retained its value. The dollar retained its value until about 100 years ago. And then you can see it starting to take off there. And in the early 70s, when they severed the link between the dollar and gold, this is when it really went off. So today you need almost $3,000 to buy what would have cost you $100 for most of the US's history. Here's another chart, similar kind of thing. Here's a quote from an economist. One of the privileges of a rich man is that he can afford to be foolish much longer than a poor man. I'm speaking about the US financial system, not just because I'm an American and I live in America, but because the entire world runs on US money and it runs on US debt. Most trade in the world is happening with dollars, even though the United States itself is not one of the partners in that trade. Everybody uses dollars. Most of it is actually just debt. It's promises that the US government is going to pay you someday. And so whatever the United States is doing with its money is affecting the whole entire world, not just the US itself. You can see here, this was, this is the amount of US dollars that exists, the amount of money. And you can see when an enormous jump was made with COVID. That kind of big gray bar on the right, the second from the right, that's the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. I remember that I was starting seminary when that was all happening. I remember how angry everybody was because they were bailing out banks. They were printing tons of money to give to these banks who had made very foolish decisions. And their CEOs were getting really big bonuses and payouts, and everyone was really mad. How could they do this? They're just kicking everybody else to the curb, and they're bailing out the banks, and everyone gets their bonuses. You can see there on that chart during that big wide gray bar, that was how much money was being printed in. When you look at the whole thing, it doesn't look like that much. Compare that to how much money they printed on that skinny gray bar on the right. That's COVID. They opened up the fire hydrant of money. They printed money like they'd never done before. It makes the financial crisis look like nothing. There was a 40% jump in the amount of money over the last couple of years, starting in the spring of 2020. That's 15% a year. Like I was saying, this is not just an issue for the United States. This is an issue that people deal with all around the world, although when the US does it, it has much more serious effects on the rest of the world, because they often have debt in US dollars. You can see all over the world, there's very serious inflation happening. You have Argentina on there, 50% inflation this year, Venezuela, 500% inflation, Turkey right now, terrible inflation, all over the world. This inflation is something that harms poor people the most. It harms people who are not connected to powerful people the most, because they have the least room to navigate the price of things going up, the price of food going up, the price of gasoline going up. If you're relatively wealthy or affluent or well-connected, generally you are much better situated to navigate the prices of things going up. And you have connections and you have networks that can help you. And sometimes, you are closer to the source of the money anyways. So for example, like even in the US, during COVID, they they printed a ton of money to pay people to stay at home or not to go to work. And so part of the way they did that was by sending out stimulus checks. They said, okay, well, don't worry, everybody, we'll send you thousands of dollars. It's going to be okay. We won't worry about how we're going to pay for all this. We're just going to print it. We'll send it to you. That's well and good if you're an American and you get these checks for a couple $1,000s, but the entire world is running on the US dollar. The entire world is using US debt. And so, the entire world did not get stimulus checks. El Salvador, they're using the dollar as one of their currencies, but now suddenly the dollar is worth a lot less, and they weren't given dollars to help them navigate that. Here's another chart to help you kind of see what's going on. These are the stock markets from around the world. The US is the top one, the blue. This is from the top of the market. This is from right before the stock market crashed in 2008. And so what you can see is starting from that peak right before 2008 until today. I mean, this is really, it's gotten worse since this. This is up through early May of this year. The stock market's gone down more since then. But from 2008, before the crash, up until May, the US stock market went up 179%. That sounds pretty good. It did better than other stock markets around the world. You have a retirement portfolio or something like that, maybe, and you think, wow, this is good. I've made a lot of money. I'm doing okay. However, when you adjust for the fact that tons and tons of money has been printed since 2008, when you would adjust the stock market value for the amount of money that's been printed, this is what you get instead. From 2008 until early May of this year, the US stock market has actually gone down by 3%. It's basically the world's been treading water because of how much money has been printed. And this is not just a US problem. Governments all over the world do this. And so they're diluting their money. And so, I mean, people, are everyone around the world is trying to beat inflation, and you chase more and more kinds of things, trying to find better and better returns so that you don't have to have your money losing its value so quickly. Look at the bottom of this slide. This is an example from my own church. We had been saving for about 20 years to be able to buy a building, usually by if we had money left over at the end of the year, we stuck it into this bank account. In 2016, when I came to this church, we had $200,000. We were earning 0.1% interest every year on that money for most of the last 6 years. Today, it's worth $164,000 in today's dollars because of how much money has been printed since then. Just by sitting on dollars, just by sitting on a bank account, in a savings account, it was a high yield savings account, 0.1% interest. Wow, really impressive. Just by sitting on it, our church lost $36,000 of purchasing power. This is something that is very painful and affects a lot of people. So that chart on the left is a rough, sketch of how much dollars have existed since 1960, and the sketch on the right is a depiction of the inflation of Bitcoin. Bitcoin inflated very quickly at the beginning. There was a lot of it being issued, but it has slowed down very rapidly, and everybody knows the schedule. They know how much Bitcoin there's going to be tomorrow, in a year, in 10 years, in 100 years, in 500 years. You can know how much Bitcoin there will be. The US dollar, no one has any idea how much there's going to be next year, or in 5 years, or in 100 years. It makes it very hard to plan for the future and save for the future. Bitcoin is voluntary. It's open to anybody. It's entirely voluntary, peaceful. It's almost impossible to confiscate. It can be sent anywhere in the world. It can be brought anywhere in the world without anybody's permission. Gold worked really well as money for a long time, but because it is so heavy and so difficult and expensive to move around, it ended up being centralized into banks, and it ended up being something that people had to take it on trust, that these banks and these governments had as much gold as they said they did, and you couldn't actually take it around with you. And Bitcoin, I think, has the good properties of gold. It's scarce. It's something that is hard to get. It's hard to make more of it. It's hard to fake it. But it also has the benefits of the US dollar. It's easy to send around the world. And it's something that you don't have to hand it over to other people and trust them like you would with gold and bank. Banks are all, in our world, banks are franchises of what we call a central bank, which is a bank created by the government. And because every bank is a franchise of the central bank, the central bank is able to block or reverse any transaction that's happening anywhere in the financial system. Bitcoin is decentralized. This is the key property of Bitcoin, is that it's decentralized. There's nobody in charge of it. There's no central hub. It's all spread out all over the world. The entire record of it is spread out on tens of thousands of computers. You cannot be blocked out of Bitcoin. People cannot confiscate it from you unless you hand over your password, or and if you lose it, you can lose your Bitcoin by forgetting your password, but people can't just decide they're going to take it from you. People have been blocked all out of the financial system all over the world. In Nigeria, in the last few years, people that were protesting against police brutality were blocked out of their bank accounts. In Russia, they have blocked the political opposition out of their bank accounts. They can't spend their money. Same thing happened. Ukraine has actually done the same exact thing. Ukraine blocked opposition political parties in the last couple of weeks out of their financial life. China, something similar. Afghanistan, there's lots of places in Afghanistan in the last few years where women have been blocked out of banking and finance just because they're women. In Canada, of course, people were blocked out of the financial system for honking and protesting the government there. They said, well, if you are doing that, or if you donated to help those people do that, you can't spend your money anymore. We're blocking you out of it. That can't happen with Bitcoin. You can't be blocked. This is a chart showing you back to this concept of salability. How easily can I transfer my money? Gold was really good at transferring money across time. It would retain its value into the future. If I saved a piece of gold today, it more or less will buy me the same stuff in 30 or 40 years or 100 years. But it's not very good at transferring value across space. It's hard to move around the world. The dollar is really good at moving around the world. It's easy to send dollars around the world, but it's terrible at sending value across time. It loses its value very quickly. Bitcoin is good at sending value across time, and it's good at sending value across space. What does the Bible have to do with all this? How do we think about this stuff theologically? The Bible, of course, teaches the importance of saving. The Bible is not too spiritual to not want to deal with money or finances or investment. Proverbs 27 says it's actually really important for us to pay attention to our wealth because it needs to be preserved. It needs to be taken care of and maintained. Something like a farm, or a house does not maintain itself. And the proverb says, know well the condition of your flocks, give attention to your herds, riches don't last forever. There is actually a Christian duty and obligation to preserve our wealth as best we can for ourselves and for other people. This is a quote from a Jewish economist, 1942. He said, inflation encourages a mentality of immediate gratification that's at variance with the discipline and eternal perspective required to exercise biblical stewardship, long-term investment for the benefit of future generations. The Bible is concerned about saving. Even the New Testament talks about the importance of saving up for the future. It's not unspiritual to do so. We also have the Bible that says quite a bit about injustice in the economic sphere. You have the Bible, of course, repeatedly condemning theft. In Judges 3 and 6, you have a couple of different regimes that roll into Israel and take over because they are, they have the most power. They're the baddest dudes around. And so they're robbing Israel of their money. They're robbing them of their produce. In 1 Kings 21, you have this story about one of Israel's own kings just deciding, I want Naboth's vineyard. I'm going to take it because I want it. He exercises a little bit of what we call eminent domain. And he is quickly condemned for this. You can't just do that. Even if you're the king, you can't just take people's stuff. Micah 2:2 talks about these rulers in Israel. They covet your fields and they seize them. They covet your houses, they take them away. They oppress a man in his house, a man in his inheritance. The Bible is deeply concerned with the mistreatment of the poor because they're the most vulnerable, because they don't have people defending them, and they are most easily taken advantage of. But the Bible also is concerned about people who have means also being robbed. In Micah, you repeatedly have the condemnation of these rulers who are taking people's inheritances from them, or taking their land from them. However wealthy you are, theft is theft. And the Bible says powerful people cannot just take it from you because they think they have a good reason to do so, or because they think they can do something better with it than you can. You also have the Bible condemning economic fraud. And so you have this repeated thing, all the Old Testament and New Testament, about paying people what you say you're going to pay them. Don't hire somebody and say, I'll pay you after you're done working today. And then when you get to the end of the day, say, oh, never mind, I'm not going to pay you after all. And he can't do anything about it because he's poor and he doesn't know anybody and he doesn't have the ear of the judge. Jesus condemns the scribes who use lots of spiritual language and guilt tripping to get widows to give them money. He says, beware of them, they're devouring the widows' houses. When you bring theft and fraud together, that's inflation. Inflation is a form of theft through deceiving people, through making more money without them realizing it and spending it before they realize what's going on. You see something sort of like that going on, I think, in Exodus 5, where the Israelite slaves are told to produce more bricks with less resources. They say, well, you're going to have to go get your own straw now, and we're going to expect the same output from you. This is a kind of backwards inflation where you have to work harder to stay in the same place. Proverbs 11:1, this is all over the Bible. God hates false balances. He hates cheating weights and measures. In the ancient world, you weighed out your money. And so if somebody could if they could lie with their weights they were using to figure out how much money you're trying to pay, then they could steal from you. God hates this stuff. He hates people being able to play fast and loose with how to measure things. And inflation is a form of playing quite a bit with how you measure value, how you value money. We have, in my tradition, in our tradition, the Reformed world, we have the larger catechism. Talks about economic injustice. This is some of its applications of the sixth commandment, don't murder. The catechism says the sixth commandment forbids neglecting or withholding the lawful and necessary means of the preservation of life. I would say, of course, one of these things includes people being able to save money for the future and for their families. It forbids oppression. It forbids whatever leads to the destruction of the life of any. As we said, inflation is causing horrible problems around the world. Especially for the poor. It's destroying their lives. This is why so many places have some people protesting right now, so angry over how quickly things have become expensive and there's no way they can keep up with it. The catechism cites Exodus 12 here, which is a bunch of Mosaic laws about what to do if somebody accidentally destroys somebody else's property, if they're being negligent and they ruin somebody else's stuff. So it's not a defense to say, well, we didn't know that it would cause these problems, or we didn't mean to ruin your lives or to make gas so expensive. The Bible says, well, no, it's not a good enough excuse to say that you meant well or you didn't mean to, that you need to make things right. You can't just ruin other people's stuff. You can't just take it from them. When the larger catechism gets to the eighth commandment, don't steal, it has a lot of things that touch on economics and money. It says that the eighth commandment requires us to be truthful and honest and just in our trade with other people. It means that we need to give back things that have been taken away from other people in a way that is against God's law. It means, this is interesting, the third bullet point, we have to study and take care to keep the things that we need, not only just need, but things that are also convenient for the sustenance of our nature, for living life in this world. It also says we should avoid suretyship. Suretyship is not just debt. I don't think the Bible condemns debt itself. Suretyship means signing somebody else's loan, saying I'll back up somebody else's loan, especially when I don't really know that person and I can't really vouch for them or keep an eye on them. I mean, I don't think it's even arguable. The entire financial system right now is based on debt. It's based on US debt. It's a form of suretyship that says that we're gonna expect future generations to back up our spending today, and we're not going to consult them about that. We're not going to ask them about that. We're just going to impose it upon them. It also says there that we're obligated by the eighth commandment to endeavor by all just and lawful means to procure, preserve, and further the wealth of other people, but also of ourselves. When it gets to what does the commandment forbid, it says it forbids theft and robbery, of course. It forbids accepting something that's been stolen, forbids fraud, forbids false weights and measures, forbids removing landmarks, moving somebody's fence. I would argue that much of what's been going on in the last 100 years has been a massive moving of the fence, of saying we know better, we're smarter, we can just put these people in charge of money and they can come up with a new way of doing money that is very different than what our ancestors have done with money and have learned in very hard ways. And we've arrogantly said we can spend and live for nothing. We can make money out of nothing, and we're going to be fine. This is, I think, a very serious form of violating the traditions that our ancestors have handed down to us. It also talks about we are forbidden from withholding from our neighbor what belongs to him or enriching ourselves. We can't just say, well, I needed that more than you, or I'm smarter than you, or I have a good idea of what to do with your money, so I'm just going to take it from you. No, you can't do that. So that's some stuff on kind of the Bible, on the confession, what it has to say with these things. I'll end with some reflections on what Bitcoin might have to do with ministry and mission in our world today. Like I said, Jesus commands us actually to get down into the mud of dealing with the money of this world in order to use it for the sake of the kingdom. Bitcoin is not going to last eternally. Gold, dollars, these things are ultimately going to fade in the grand scheme of eternity. But we are here in this world. This is still God's world, and he expects us to live and serve him in it, even though we know that the world to come is the one that is really going to last forever. I think we should be thinking seriously about these things, inflation, confiscation, and Bitcoin as a possible solution to these things, because, first of all, because of all the suffering that these things cause. There's incredible suffering going on around the world right now, and there's a lot more coming. There's no possible way that they can afford to pay back the debts that they're running up. And the outcome of that is not just, oh, well, we're sorry. Hopefully it works out okay. There's great pain that comes when you've spent way more than you can afford. As many of us could attest, if people in our churches lived the way that governments around the world live with their money, we would be warning them up and down and left and right, saying, what are you doing? This is going to be really painful. You need to stop doing this. You're harming a lot of people. And so we should care about this, because people are hurting around us, and they're going to be hurting. And we should try to help them to avoid the pain that's coming. We should be talking about these things and thinking about them, because like we said, the commandments require us and command us to preserve wealth, not only our wealth. Of course, I want to preserve my wealth. I love money. I'm greedy. I'd like to have lots and lots of money. But first of all, we should be trying to preserve other people's wealth. It's not unspiritual to do this. This is part of life in God's world. Also, it raises these issues of stewardship, both for ourselves, but also as churches. At some point, I think we need to be asking ourselves hard questions about, are we being good stewards if we just sit on dollars, knowing how much value it's losing? My church, like I said, we sat on this cash because we didn't want to be bogged down with trying to manage investments and things like that. It's understandable. But at some point, are we being bad stewards of the congregation's money by just putting it in dollars when it's going to just evaporate? When I last gave this presentation, somebody gave me a hard time about it afterwards, and he said, oh, Christians shouldn't be thinking about these things. They should just think about heaven. And I said, well, okay, what would you say to Christians in Zimbabwe? A lot of people around the world save not in their own currency, they save in dollars, because the dollar is the least bad option in the world. A lot of Christians in Zimbabwe or Ukraine or wherever, they're saving their money in dollars. Are they being bad Christians by doing that because they're trying to preserve their money in a better way than their own money can? And he said, well, no, that's something different. I don't think it's different. I think Bitcoin, in the long run, in the short term, it's very volatile. I think in the long run, Bitcoin is actually a very conservative way to preserve your wealth into the future, because it's predictable, it's decentralized, nobody can block me out of it. Thinking in terms of mercy, like we've been saying, inflation harms the poor the most. It harms the weak, it harms people who are disconnected. We should be concerned about this. God is deeply concerned for people in the world who have nobody to speak for them. He's deeply concerned that we look out for the interests of those who are being kicked around. Of course, inflation also encourages, incentivizes people to live in all kinds of ways that are actually very destructive to them and their families and their communities. It encourages you to live for the present instead of saving for the future. Why would you save for the future if you have no idea how much money you're going to have or how much it's going to be worth? Or we do know, the money's going to be worth a lot less in the future. And so that implicitly, even if you don't realize it, that encourages you to spend now, to go into debt now. All kinds of ways that this has very strange, very harmful effects on our world, and especially on the poor. Thinking in terms of missions around the world, things are, not good in America where I live, but things are a lot worse in other parts of the world. There's Christians being very seriously persecuted around the world. And so something like Bitcoin is a way for people to be able to withdraw from the financial system and be protected from it. They can't be confiscated by governments or organizations or people around them who don't like them. Money can be sent around the world without permission. So you could send money to Christians anywhere in the world through the Bitcoin network. without the government stopping it at the border and saying, well, we don't want you sending money here because we don't want it to go to those people. And there's some really interesting missions applications for Bitcoin. And then just speaking personally, and depending on what your contexts are, I'm not sure what your guys' contexts are like. I have personally found here in Austin, this has just been an incredibly fruitful arena for evangelism. Bitcoiners tend to be very deeply interested in truth, in reality, in God, in tradition, the way things used to be done, in the history of the world. They're very interested in the future because they're realizing that I have this money that I can save in that I know will be preserved into the future. And so they start thinking more about the future. They're very skeptical about consumerism. They're skeptical about things that are just about feeling good, about living for today. And so I've just had some of the best evangelistic conversations I've had in years with Bitcoin people, because asking questions about what money is and why our money is so strange and so weird and leads to so many problems, it very quickly leads you into very deep questions about truth and about reality and even about God and who he is. So I've just had a wonderful time here in Austin, getting to know these Bitcoin people and sharing the gospel with them and trying to point them to the ultimate hope in Christ, that only he can satisfy us eternally. But at the same time, pointing out that, yeah, the Bible really cares about a lot of these issues that you're angry about, and that, these issues of injustice. Christians should not just be, very, piously sitting around waiting to go to heaven. The Bible has a lot to say to these things. But ultimately, of course, our hope is in the world to come. So anyways, that's my talk. Jim Belcher is here. Some of you guys might remember him from back in the day at Knox. He is also, learning a lot about Bitcoin, interested in it. Matt, I'm not sure how you want to have Jim share what he's doing, and if any of you are interested in talking to him, how you can get in touch with him.
Yeah, well, Jim, I'll give you the floor in just a couple minutes here before we wrap up. And actually, speaking of Jim, this is first of all, Tim, thanks so much for this presentation today. Great job, and just thanks again, just for what a huge wealth of knowledge and information that you just kind of downloaded for us. So really appreciate that. Jim was actually checking your math on, and he was saying, hey, so going back to your example of the church, of your savings account, if you would have invested all of that money into Bitcoin in 2016, he estimates today you would probably be sitting on $7.6 million. Have you done the math on that yet, Tim, or are we just going to trust?
No, here let me read something to you. Actually, at the end of 2019, right before Bitcoin had its last really big run up, one of our deacons actually formally proposed that our church take 10% of its building fund and put it into Bitcoin. And everybody laughed him off. I was kind of interested in the idea. And I was still like, yeah, I don't know about that. But let me find it. He said, and so I actually went back recently and I checked the math. If we would have taken his, proposal and done what he said, that, $20,000 would have turned into something like $300,000 or $400,000 today.
Wow.
And, this is a big, question. And I'm working with my elders. I'm trying to convince them to hold some of our church's money in Bitcoin. It's a hard sell because it's very volatile and it's scary and people don't understand it. And it seems like some weird kooky internet thing. But, long term, I'm hoping to convince them to at least put a small percentage of our church's operating expenses into Bitcoin as a way of preserving it against inflation.
Well, you presented some really good evidence, I think, for people who are concerned about the volatility issue. I mean, even Bill Gates went on record and said, like, this is not something that is probably worth investing into. I mean, you're talking about one of the world's wealthiest men, but of course, if you're at the top and you're already well invested into the dollar, why say do something else, which may just only further prove your point. Vincent, though, is asking a great question on the same issue, and that is, he's saying, hi, Prof. Tim, great talk. How do you balance the volatility issues surrounding Bitcoin? And he gives the example of, just for example, Elon Musk coming in, wanting to buy Twitter, and then eroding 30% of its value. Markets seem to be swinging so quickly. Bitcoin at an all-time high. It has now lost a significant portion of its value. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a chart that I put in the appendix of my little presentation of the monthly price moves for the price of gold during Weimar Germany's hyperinflation during the early 20s. And so, if you smooth it out, the value of gold went up like crazy. It was a parabolic move up as their money went insane and they destroyed their money. But from month to month, it went up and down like crazy. It was really volatile because people were gambling on which direction it was going to go, and they would lose a lot of money gambling one way or the other. Yeah, I mean, the Bitcoin is still very volatile. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that big compared to the rest of the financial system. And so because of that, it's sensitive to various factors. Some of that, people gambling. So like recently, Bitcoin really went down related to other cryptocurrencies, people gambling on those and doing very foolish things with it. And that, has knock-on effects on Bitcoin. When you zoom out, let's say to a 4 to 5 to 10 year horizon on Bitcoin, it's up and to the right. So volatile it's not necessarily bad. It's bad if you need money, in 6 months. But if you're thinking longer term, if you're thinking at least a few years out, then if you're volatile in the right direction, if you're volatile up and to the right, then it's actually a good thing. I'd much rather have volatility up than smoothly going down, which is what the dollar is doing. The flip side of this, it's not like sitting on dollars is a neutral option. If you're just sitting on dollars, like my church has been, then what you are doing is you are choosing to you're putting your chips into the basket of the dollar. And as you're doing that, it's losing its value slowly over time. The question, is there's no neutral option. You always have to be doing something with your money. And so, how do you do that? This is what we all are trying to figure out all the time. Why to do this versus that versus this. I would just say, yeah, I tell people, I say, don't put money in this that you're going to need in the next few years. I didn't say anything in my presentation about the price of it. In some ways, the price is not the important thing. The price goes up as people realize why this is valuable and why it's important. The reason it's valuable and important is because it's decentralized. It has a fixed supply. You can't be blocked out of it. That's why people buy it. And as more people realize what it is, and it's not just some fake drug dealer, magic money, and that this is something that lasts for the long term, that's why the value of it goes up against the backdrop of there being less and less and less of it available for people to buy. And one thing I would say too, and I don't think I forgot to say this at the beginning, is that, obviously I've only been talking about Bitcoin. People lump Bitcoin into crypto quite a bit. Personally, I think, you should basically avoid everything except Bitcoin. There might be some other interesting applications for a couple of the other ones, but for the most part, I think they're Ponzi schemes. I think, if you're into getting venture capitalists rich in Silicon Valley, if that's your thing, sure, go for it, get them really rich. But Bitcoin, I think, really is unique. And it's not just, one among 19,000 other cryptocurrencies. There's a lot of reasons it's very important and unique. And I would say stay away from the other stuff.
So kind of on that note, I heard recently too, just that some have argued that potentially the same power dynamics are at play here in Bitcoin than it would be than, say, traditional financial markets, fiat, for example, as you've already laid out for us. Early adopters into Bitcoin had more wealth, more capital, more ability to buy in. They had the most to gain. They have gained the most. And so with there being less available, there's less return for the average user to come in. So perhaps later adopters are not going to do as well necessarily into this new financial market. Are we just kind of destined? Some might just say like, hey, we're just destined to continue to have these power games, and we're going to keep repeating the same patterns of abuse and oppression in our financial systems for each other. What would you say to somebody who's thinking that right now?
Well, yeah, I'd say, Bitcoin does not solve the problem of the sinful human heart. People are always going to be finding ways to cheat each other and rob each other and take advantage of each other. That's always going to be here until Jesus comes back. Bitcoin makes it a lot harder. Nobody's forced to participate in Bitcoin. It's voluntary. You're forced to use dollars in America. If you're an American citizen, you have to pay taxes everywhere you live in the world. It's one of the only countries that makes you pay taxes no matter where you're living. Nobody is forced to use Bitcoin. You get to opt into it. You can opt out of it. The people that get into it earlier, of course, they make more money on it. It's the same with anything. People who understood what Amazon was a lot earlier, understood what the internet was a lot earlier when everyone was making fun of it and said, this is just like the fax machine, who cares? yeah, those people made a lot of money. But that is their reward for understanding something a lot sooner than everybody else did. Everybody who gets into something like Bitcoin feels like, oh, I'm really late. I got into it way too late. What's the point? It's really expensive now. It's not expensive now. It's in the grand scheme of how much money there is in the world and what it's used for. And see, even something like gold and what it's used for. Bitcoin is still very small. The point of it, it's not the point is not to get rich. Even though I think people who buy it now, again, this is entertainment purposes only. People who get into it earlier, of course, if it goes up, will become wealthier as the value of the dollar goes down. But that's not really the point of it. The point of it is a secure money that's predictable into the future that no one can steal from you. Unlike the system we're living in now, you can't just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, it's pretty bad, the situation we're in. Isn't that terrible? Yeah, it is terrible. But, you could have said the same thing about, the transatlantic slave trade. Oh, well, it's really bad. We've always had slavery. Isn't this terrible? And people like William Wilberforce said, no, it doesn't have to be this way. We can get rid of this. We can stop it, even though it's been around for thousands of years. It would have been terrible and unchristian for people to say, oh, well, sin.
Yeah, so and I think that's really helpful for us to hear, just because it seems like one of the motivations for something like a Bitcoin is, in fact, maybe a general distrust of whether it be government or those who would seek to manipulate the financial systems for their own gain, and for people to continue to promote oppression and injustice around the world, not just here in the United States, but of course anywhere around the world, right? And so, regardless of where anybody is, whether they trust their government more or less, let's put that issue to the side. But just say, how can Christians just really see this as an opportunity to be more engaged, to do the pursuit of the common good? When it comes to wealth, money, generosity, caring for the poor, the vulnerable. We have an alum right now who's on with us, who's telling us about being an international worker, and where he's currently serving is the inflation rate is so high that there's great fear, there's protests. I mean, we're not seeing protests in the United States today, other than if you're watching a cable news TV show. But beyond that, I mean, nobody's taking to the streets. But in other parts of the world, as of today of this recording, that is taking place. So how can Christians continue to be engaged in this work, not just locally, but certainly abroad, anywhere around the world?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's like, I'm trying to do it. I'm trying to educate people about it. Someone like Jim Belcher here, he's trying to educate them about it, because it's like, yeah, this is not an unspiritual thing. Is it the mission of my church to, make really good money in the world and make sure lots of people are on it? No, that's not what my church exists to do. However, my church is not the only thing around. And as Christians, we are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, but we're also citizens of this world. And we're living as citizens of heaven in this world. And God has a lot of things to say about life in this world and what we should be doing in it. And part of what it means to grow as a disciple of Jesus is learning to obey him in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of activities. This was a big deal, in the Reformation, of course, as they said, well, yeah, God doesn't really need, Luther said, God doesn't need your works, but your neighbor does. And so, the milkmaid, the shoemaker, he's just as important to the kingdom of God as the pastor is, or the nun, or the priest. And so, yeah, we should care about this stuff. I think these monetary issues, they're under the surface. A lot of people don't see it or think about it, but they are, I think, one of the main reasons behind so much of the dysfunction and the insanity in our world, that Christians should care about it and should work against it in whatever little ways they can. Bitcoin is one way to do that, and it's a very simple way to do that. It's just a way of saying, I'm withdrawing from this system. I don't want to participate in it. And you don't have to ask anybody's permission to do that. And this, typically, historically, money dies when people don't trust it anymore. And that's where hyperinflation comes from. Is nobody believes in it anymore. No one believes the promises behind it. And so they run out as soon as they get any of this money, and they run out and buy other things like bread or rocks or houses or gold or Bitcoin or whatever it is. And so it's like, people, when they lose their trust in the promises that are behind their money, they're looking for something else, because of course we have a natural desire to preserve our wealth for the sake of our families and our communities and our churches and all these things. And so in some ways it's a very natural human thing to want to do this kind of stuff, but it's also, as Christians, it's a way to love our neighbors and honor God by caring about justice.
Well, what I appreciate most about this conversation right now is is just how you are reminding us of the how integrated we are as a people, as a society, as a humanity, and seeing globally. It's not just me and my family and me and my church community and me and other Christians, but actually it's the whole humanity. It's the world and how interconnected we are, and how we've seen it even just living through a pandemic and just seeing how supply chains are just so interconnected now. And now with war breaking out in Ukraine, and seeing how interconnected we are. The fact that I have troubles finding bags of brown rice, like other types of things, because of a war that's happening and gas prices are increasing, and just there's no escaping that. And so it all fits into that, of course, not just at the human level, but of course the spiritual one as well too. So Tim, thanks so much for your time on this. We're going to invite Jim just to real quick to come on in, and give Jim here a second. I think hopefully he'll pop in here in just a moment. But Tim, thanks again. This has been such a great presentation, and thanks just to our alum who have been a part of this. And Jim, I see you coming in here. When you get all set, I want you to say hello and introduce yourself to everyone as a reminder.
All right. I think can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can.
All right. Well, thanks, Matt, for putting this on, and for Tim. Great. That's a great presentation. I'm pretty new to Bitcoin, really 6 months, but have traveled down the rabbit hole pretty deeply. I don't think I've been this fascinated by a topic in many, many years. I had taken my family in January to Europe. We were in Spain and Croatia, just to believe it or not, because the cost of living was a lot cheaper there to be a writer than it is in California. And one of the things on my list was to study Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. I just felt like it was a big gap in my own learning. And I started with a book called The Bitcoin Standard, which really, I think, was the book that orange pilled me, as they say. And really, to me, it was a missing piece. I had just finished a book where I claimed in Cold Civil War. It's an InterVarsity book. It came out in March, where I had claimed that the elites have rigged the system, both political, cultural, and the Wall Street elites had rigged this system. And they had done it in politics and culture and economics. But other than a few mentions of how they did it in economics, I spent most of the time looking at how they have done it culturally and politically. And I would get interviewed on the radio, and they would always ask me so they would say, okay, this is pretty depressing. If we care about constitutional republicanism, how do we win it back? And I really didn't have, even in my book, I basically say it's a 30-year project of education. The church has to lead. I have a short chapter on the church. And really, what we need is revival, right? And I still believe that. But then when I started studying Bitcoin, I realized, there's a lever out there that could really start pulling back power from the elites of both parties who have really rigged the money printing in their favor. And that's when I went down the rabbit hole really hard and started realizing that, this is a great store of value for anyone who's listening. But more than that, it's a way of restraining elites, because in Bitcoin, you can't print money. There's a $21 million cap that's written into the code, and they can't just print money every time they have new pet projects. If you look at the growth of the dollar, Tim showed the chart that went straight up in the money printing and the inflation, and you compare that to the size, the growth of our government, they are almost parallel. When you look back to the 1920s and the beginning of the progressive movement, the New Deal, and then eventually the welfare state in the 60s, politicians just said, we can just print money, not only to go to all these endless wars, but we can print money for every social program. And I talk about in the book how dangerous or how bad that has been in creating a dependency on our government, and not on our churches, not on one another, right? And not on our own wits. And so, there are so many reasons to like Bitcoin, and Tim alluded to them. I mean, it's a new monetary system. It helps correct a lot of the problems in the old monetary, in the fiat monetary system. It's a great store of value. I mean, Bitcoin is becoming a worldview. And I think, Tim started at the beginning talking about there's two books that we look at. We look at Revelation and we look at Common Grace, or general revelation. Catholics call it natural law. I use the term natural law because the reformers use it too. That those are, when we look at both, we realize that the reason so many non-Christians are attracted to Bitcoin and then asking big questions about truth and about God is because they've tapped into something of God's design, something of his justice, something of his fairness. And they see this in Bitcoin and they're really excited about it. And that's why I think Tim told me once that some of his best apologetic conversations in Austin haven't been with his non-Christian neighbors, they've been with Bitcoiners. Because they see this as a worldview that really starts to line up with natural law. And so I'll stop there. I mean, there's so many reasons to be interested and excited about it. And I won't repeat the ones Tim did. I just wanted to add a couple of my own. I wrote on my Substack, if people are interested, at jimbelcher.substack, I wrote 3 articles about my journey down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. One of the things I talk about a lot is the importance of it resists censorship. So what we're seeing now is governments are censoring people, shutting down bank accounts. If they don't like your speech, if they don't like your sermons, if they don't like your politics, they use the financial systems to shut us down. And Bitcoin protects us against that because they can't steal it. They can't get to it. The Chinese government's tried for years to steal and to hack into Bitcoin, the Bitcoin network, and they couldn't. So they just eventually banned it and kicked it out. But it's censorship resisting, which is one of the things it should be important for Christians when we think about religious freedom. But I'll stop there. I could talk all day about it. And anybody else who wants to talk about it, let me know.
Jim, thanks so much. I can follow you your Substack. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. I haven't written a bunch. I'm going to start writing some more on Bitcoin. Tim and I just hung out in Austin. I was there a week ago or 10 days ago. We hung out with some other Bitcoiners. So it kind of motivated me to write more on Bitcoin. So I'm going to start doing that. But I'm also thinking about an onboarding app for Christians and churches. So I would love to interview anybody who's interested, who's on this Zoom, because I just want to find out what their interest level is. I know Tim mentioned that his elders are, are reluctant, but I'd love to hear what the others on this call are thinking about. Are they open to it? Do they just not know how to do it? I mean, it's hard. There's so many options to buy it. And when I wanted to buy it, it took me a while to figure out who I could trust, because I didn't want to put some of my retirement money into it and then lose it. So I had to learn about self-custody. I mean, there's a learning curve with Bitcoin. But I'm assuming the people on this call are pretty intelligent and curious people. That's what Knox attracts. So I would imagine they don't mind putting in the effort.
Yeah,
and Tim
Tim
can give resources too.
Well, thanks so much, Jim, and just really appreciate your insight. And maybe we'll have to have a second run at this with maybe you and Tim together. And Ross also too just kind of commented in as well. He said, Bitcoin has some really powerful opportunities in funding missionaries in closed countries, and I've heard about that as well too. So just maybe the use of these kind of new ways of financing and exchanging monies around the world to help fund those projects sounds like some really great opportunities. Well, we're going to wrap it up here. We're way over time. Jim, thank you. Tim, again, thank you so much. Just both of you guys, just for your time on this, and to our alumni, thanks again for joining us for this exclusive opportunity and content. And we look forward to serving you more further at Knox Theological Seminary. Have a great rest of your day and a great week, and enjoy the rest of your summer.
Awesome.